Well, good afternoon. I just heard from the organizers that most of you will be listening me for the first time. And so I have to probably, is this on? Oh. I see some familiar faces, but I have to explain why I think the way I do, because the conclusions that I reach will be dramatically different from what you have been hearing on Japan or for the US and Europe. Because, as you know, I came up with this concept of balance sheet recession, which are now used by a lot of policymakers, academics all around the world, including Chairman Bernanke. But I don't think it's it's fully understood. So for those of you who heard me speak on this topic, you can take a nap for maybe 10 minutes before I get to the real core of the issue. But before I begin, I think, before I get into the core of the issues, I must say that what's been happening around the world, and there's a lot of debate as to what is the right thing to do. Should there be more fiscal stimulus, less fiscal stimulus, more monetary stimulus, less? Should the bankers force to write off problem loans quickly, or they should go by so-called pretend and extend and go slowly? Should the bankers be increasing capital ratios quickly, or should they be allowed to do that with more time? And what to do with the rating agencies? All of those issues that are debated in Europe and United States today were debated in Japan 15 years ago. Every one of them. And so for those of us who were here, who went through that debate, we should be able to tell what is going to happen abroad, especially in the US and Europe, based on our own experience. And so for the last 2 years, 2-3 years, actually longer, but people start listening to me for the last 2-3 years, I should say, I've been going around telling people that there's something to be learned from Japan. But every time I start with that line, I get this very nasty look, especially in Europe and United States, that learning from Japan? Forget it. Japan did everything wrong. It's too little, too late, all the wrong policies, all the wrong timing. There's nothing to learn from Japan. Japan is a counterexample, what not to do. And perhaps some of you are involved in that conspiracy as well. It's very difficult to set the record straight on Japan because so much has been written, and so much of them are absolutely incorrect in my view. But I don't have a time to explain why things were reported so poorly. But I'd just like to start with this chart here, which shows what happened to Japanese house prices 15 years ago compared to US house prices during this crisis. And the heavy line is the US house prices, the Case-Shiller index that everybody looks at. And the other two are the Japanese house prices in Tokyo and Osaka areas. And as you can see, both on the way up and on the way down, both the magnitude and durations are very, very similar. And whenever I start with this chart, even the noisiest Americans shut up. There's a, oh shoot, didn't realize we were that similar. And here you see house prices stabilizing in the US. I was told by many housing specialists in the United States that this happened because so many people have seen this chart and said, oh, Japanese house prices stabilized here, so it's okay to buy. And this is American real estate people telling me. And so the two, I'm afraid, have caught the same disease, and similar things are happening in Europe as well. Now, this is the comparison of US commercial real estate and what happened to Japan. Now, the Japanese line is the red one, and the US line is the blue one. Now, on the way up, Japanese real estate prices did skyrocket much, much faster than in the US. And, Imperial Palace Garden worth the entire state of California, that was basically talking about this line. But on the way down, the two are also moving quite similarly. And most recently, US commercial real estate prices seems to have stabilized. But for those of you who have been following US regulators closely, it is this period that Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and Comptroller of Currency jointly issued this directive now called in the market, pretend and extend. Pretend that everything is okay, pretend that commercial real estate prices did not fall, and continue to roll over the debt. Because with 42% decline in commercial real estate values, none of these banks are able to roll over the loans at the original value if you're supposed to meet the regulated loan-to-value ratios. But if these banks refuse to roll over those commercial real estate, the U.S. commercial real estate market will have collapsed because so much rolling over is taking place at this period. So realizing how bad the situation is, Federal Reserve, the FDIC, Comptroller of Currency jointly told the banks, pretend that everything is okay, and please extend the loan, meaning roll over the loans. So basically, even Americans are doing what Ministry of Finance used to do in Japan. And when you have a problem of the same magnitude, this is the only option you have. Now, against this bursting of the bubble, U.S. Central Bank brought rates down from 5.25 to the Japanese level, the fastest rate in Federal Reserve's history. And other central banks also dropped rates as well. And in the case of U.S., it kept it low for the last 3 years. U.S. rates have been zero for full 3 years now. And in spite of that, this is the U.S. economy. Industrial production returned to the level of 2005 compared to where it was right after the Lehman shock. But it's still a long way to go before reaching the previous peak. And unemployment rate still at 8.5%. 6-7 million people are still out of job. Now, some of you may not realize how significant this point is, that with zero interest rates, the U.S. is suffering 8.5% unemployment rate. But when I was running econometric models at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, that was long ago, we had the U.S. econometric model very responsive to interest rate changes, meaning compared to Japanese or continental European economies, U.S. economy was very sensitive to monetary policy changes. And the reason is very simple. In the U.S., it's very easy to lay off workers with a very flexible labor market. And so as soon as interest rates are changed, companies make adjustments and economy responds. And that's not the case in Japan and continental Europe, where it's difficult to lay off workers. Based on that knowledge that U.S. economy is supposed to be very sensitive to interest rate changes, the fact that United States is still suffering 8.5% unemployment rate with zero interest rates for 3 years is totally unthinkable. With zero interest rates, the U.S. should be having 3 or 4 bubbles by now, and unemployment rate probably 2% or even zero. But that's just not the case. And how is it in Europe? Well, it's actually quite similar. Industrial production back to the level of 2005, but unemployment 10.3%, the worst in Euro's history. And even this chart for Eurozone is somewhat misleading, because when you look at individual countries, you notice that Germany is doing very well. In fact, it actually reached the previous peak. It's the only industrialized nation that reached the previous peak, reached in 2008 for industrial production. But if you look at the other countries, France, the industrial production is still at the level of 1997. Italy, 1993, nearly 20 years ago's levels. And Spain, 1996. And it's not just industrial production or unemployment that is causing problems. Money supply is not growing in these economies either. And this comes as a surprise to a lot of people, because when you look at the press, and many of you are from the press, I should be careful here perhaps. But there's so much talk about flooding the place with liquidity, QE1, QE2, Bank of England doing massive liquidity injections. You think that with that much liquidity injections, massive increase in balance sheets of central banks, you would think that there's so much money available with inflation just around the corner. But when you actually look at the numbers, you realize that that's simply not the case. Now, what I show here are three monetary aggregates. The red line, monetary base, is how much liquidity or bank reserves the central bank put into the system. The blue line is the money supply, which is how much money private sector gets to spend. And the green line is the credit available to the private sector, how much money private sector borrowed. And the last line is the inflation rate. And what we learn in universities, if you remember, is that those three lines are supposed to move together. So if central bank increases liquidity in the system by 10%, money supply is supposed to increase by 10%, credit available to the private sector also increase by 10%. And you may wonder, did something like that actually happen? Well, if you look at the period before Lehman shock, three lines were moving beautifully together. So we were in that world that we learn in universities. But once the Lehman shock hit, you can see all three lines going all over the map. Federal Reserve indeed increased liquidity in the system from 100 to over 300. That should have increased money supply by 300%, but money supply grew very, very slowly, and credit available to the private sector actually shrunk. And as a result, and with this kind of money supply growth, there's no way we're going to have inflation anytime soon. And if the credit available to the private sector is actually shrinking, in an inflationary environment, or if people believe that inflation is coming, it makes sense to borrow money, because in inflation, the borrower wins and the lender loses. But what this indicates is that no one is thinking that inflation is around the corner, because credit available to the private sector, how much money private sector borrowed, is actually shrinking. And sure enough, inflation rate hasn't picked up at all, in spite of this massive increase in liquidity, massive increase in bank reserves. And same story in Euroland, or Eurozone. Three lines are moving together, but after that, they're all over the map. And the inflation rate in the CPI core, not the headline inflation rate, because that's affected by high oil prices and things like that, but CPI core not accelerating very much either. And finally, this is the UK. UK, three lines are moving more or less together before the Lehman shock. And after the Lehman shock, I have to say this because I cannot contain it. Bank of England Governor Mr. Marvin King said, we're not going to be like the Japanese. We're going to increase the we do the massive quantitative easing, get the money supply to increase, and we're going to get the UK economy out of the mess very quickly. We're not going to be like the Japanese. Remember that? And those of us in Japan said, okay, try it. You like it. And look what happened. Yes, he did increase the monetary base massively from 100 to nearly 270. Look what happened to money supply. It did not grow at all. Credit available to the private sector actually shrinking. And the UK economy is doing very poorly as a result. A couple months ago, there was a massive riot. With this kind of money supply growth, of course, people are very disappointed, because in spite of all that work by the Bank of England, average people felt no increase in the availability of money that they can spend. And inflation rate, if you remove indirect taxes, did not pick up at all. This is the world we went through in Japan for the last 20 years. This shows the same monetary aggregates. During the bubble days, three lines are moving beautifully together. And a few years after the bubble, that was also true as well. But around 1993, 1994, three began to diverge. Bank of Japan trying to get the economy going by massively increasing monetary base, including the quantitative easing starting from 2001. But money supply grew very, very slowly, and credit available to the private sector actually shrunk. And as a result, we don't have inflation, we actually have deflation in our hands. How do we get this result? How come all the relationship we learn in universities about what the central bank can do and to get the economy moving are all breaking down? Well, there's a very simple reason behind it. This shows what happened to Japanese corporate demand for funds, how much money Japanese companies raise from both the capital market and the banking system. And during the bubble days, second half of the 80s, you see Japanese companies borrowing and investing like crazy. And because the economy was doing so well, Bank of Japan was raising short-term interest rates to all the way to 8% when inflation rate was only around 3. Tried to cool the economy down. And once the bubble burst, 1990, 1991, you see demand for funds falling very, very sharply. Bank of Japan, realizing the economy is weakening, also brought the rates down from 8% almost to 0 by 1995. And look what happens afterwards. The demand for fund actually goes into negative and stays negative for full 10 years until 2006. We never learned this in universities. Companies are not supposed to pay down debt when interest rates are 0. Because when interest rates are 0 and companies are paying down debt, the usual interpretation in business schools is that corporate presidents are so inept that these guys cannot find good use for the money even with 0 interest rates. But if that's the case, the company should just dissolve itself, give the money back to the shareholders so the shareholders can find something better to do with the money. So something like this is not supposed to happen. Companies are not supposed to pay down debt when interest rates are 0. They're supposed to be borrowing money. But it happened in Japan for a full 10 years, and this is happening all over the world today, at least in the developed world. And why is this happening? Well, when you think about it, the reason is very, very simple. During the bubble days, these guys bought all sorts of assets, thinking that they're going to make tons of money. When the bubble burst, the asset prices collapsed, but the liabilities remained. And asset prices down, liabilities still up there, means they are all basically bankrupt. Some of them very significantly so. Now, bankrupt means these guys are not finished, but there's actually two kinds of bankruptcies when you think about it. The usual bankruptcy is that the cars and cameras that these companies brought to the market were not valued by the society. They tried to put in more advertising expenditure to get these stocks moving, still to no avail, and eventually companies go bust. Well, in that case, that's the end of the story. But there's another kind of bankruptcy, and that is that cars and cameras are still selling very well. But because of the silly decision management made during the bubble days, the balance sheet is underwater. Now, if you are in that situation where the company still has cash flow, but the balance sheet is underwater, you're bankrupt, what is the right thing to do? Well, it doesn't matter whether you're Japanese, or American, or Taiwanese, or what. The right thing to do under the circumstance is to use the cash flow to pay down debt. Because if you have the cash flow to pay down debt, and slowly you pay it down, at some point your balance sheets will be balanced again. Because asset prices never go negative, so at some point your balance sheet will be balanced again. And once that is balanced, you can say, I'm out of this mess, now I start making money again. Well, that's the right thing to do at the individual level, because you don't want to tell your shareholders, sorry, it's all piece of paper now. You don't want to tell your bankers it's all non-performing loans. You don't want to tell your workers you have no more jobs tomorrow. So for individual stakeholders of the firm, the right thing to do is to use the cash flow to pay down debt. Problem is, when everybody does it all at the same time, what happens to the national economy? In the national economy, if someone is saving money or paying down debt, which is the same thing, you better have someone on the other side borrowing and spending money to keep the economy going. Suppose I have $1,000 of income, I spent $900 myself and decide to save $100. The $900 is already someone else's income. That's not a problem. This $100 that I decide to save will go through the financial types, who will then lend to someone who can use it. That person borrows and spends the $100. So the total expenditure in the economy will be $900 that I spent, plus $100 that this guy borrowed and spent. $1,000 against the original income of $1,000, and the economy moves forward. If there are too many borrowers, interest rates are raised, some drops out. If too few borrowers, interest rates are lowered, and the remaining sum are eventually borrowed and spent. That's the usual economy. That's what we learn in universities. But what happens here? Even at 0 interest rates, people are paying down debt. Nobody's borrowing money. So if I have $1,000 of income, I decide to save $100 and decide to spend $900 and decide to save $100. $900 is already someone else's income. That's not a problem. But this $100 that I decide to save comes into the financial sector and it gets stuck. It can't go out because no one's borrowing money even with 0 interest rates. So what happens to the economy? Well, it was originally $1,000. Now only $900 spent. Now 900 maybe is already someone else's income. If that person says, okay, let's save 10%, decide to spend $810, decide to save $90, that $90 gets stuck here too, because this goes on for 10 years. So if nothing is done to this situation, the economy will go from 1,900, 810, 730 very, very quickly, even with zero interest rates. That's the problem of this type of private sector behavior. And because there's no name for this type of recession in economics, I called it balance sheet recession. Because people are no longer maximizing profits, these guys are minimizing debt. And when everybody's minimizing debt, we run into this problem. And you may wonder, did anything like this ever happen before? Well, it did. The Great Depression in the United States from October 1929 was exactly this type of recession. When you go back and look at all the numbers, you realize that everybody was paying down debt after stock market crash, October 1929 in New York. Everybody was in the market with borrowed money. So liabilities were still up there. Asset prices collapsed. Everybody started paying down debt all at the same time. But there was no one on the other side borrowing and spending money. So US fell into this 1,900, 810, 700 process. In just 4 years, United States lost 46% of its GDP. Unemployment rate skyrocketing to over 50% in major cities, 25% nationwide. So that's the danger of this private sector minimizing debt. Then you look at what happened to Japan's GDP. This is the Japanese GDP, both in nominal and real terms, and Japanese commercial real estate prices. Now, commercial real estate prices skyrocketed in the late 80s, and when people felt rich, spent a lot of money, GDP went up. That's no brainer. Anyone can explain that part. But what's remarkable about the Japanese experience is what happened afterwards. The bubble burst in 1990, 1991, and you have this nice Mount Fuji here, but there's nothing pretty about this side of Mount Fuji. Asset prices collapsed. Commercial real estate prices fell 87% nationwide. Now try to imagine that in any other country. United States, San Francisco price down 87, New York down 87, Chicago down 87, Orlando down 87. What kind of economy do you think got left in the US? Or in the UK, London prices down 87, Edinburgh down 87, Manchester down 87. What will be left in the US, UK? Then you look at Japan's GDP. It never fell below the peak of the bubble. This line is the peak of the bubble. Both in nominal and real terms, it was always above the peak of the bubble, with 87% decline in commercial real estate prices nationwide, and private sector deleveraging like crazy, paying down debt. How did we do that? Well, very simple. Government borrowed $100 and spent it. If government borrowed $100 and spent it, it's $900 plus $100,000 against the original income of the $1,000. There's no reason for GDP to fall. The next year, the same thing happens. Household paying down, companies not borrowing money. Well, how come same thing happens year after year after year? Well, with 87% decline in asset prices, 1 or 2 years of debt repayment is not enough. It may take 5 years for some companies, others may take 10. If you're unlucky enough to have bought at the peak, it may take 20 years before your balance sheet is repaired. But people then are doing that, and year after year after year, Japanese government borrowed the gap and put that back into the income stream. As a result, this is what happened to Japanese government finances. Tax revenue fell even with the GDP up there because of what happened to asset prices, and there were some tax cuts as well. And government spending kept on increasing because during this period, we were blessed with liberal Democrats running the show, who are highly liberal with public spending. So as soon as the economy began to weaken, these guys said, oh, let's build roads and bridges, thinking that those things will then pump prime the economy and get the economy going. Well, this chart in Japan is now known as the alligator's mouth, which refuses to close for some reason. Now, the gap between the two, of course, is the budget deficit. And if you add the budget deficit from 1990 to 2005, why 2005? Well, 2005, Japanese debt repayment, corporate debt repayment finally stopped. So I would consider that as the end for Japan's worst part of what I call balance sheet recession. If you add all the deficit from 1990 to 2005, it adds up to 460 trillion yen, 92% of Japan's GDP, no peanuts. But I would argue that this was a money very well spent Because when you come back to this chart and try to imagine what might have happened to Japan or any country with asset prices down 87% from the peak and the entire private sector deleveraging, what might have happened to that country's GDP? Well, I just penciled in this dotted line. This dotted line simply indicates Japanese GDP returning to the level of, to its level before the bubble. And the bubble in Japan started around 1986. So I just drew this line, penciled in this line, returning to the level of 1985. And this is, in my view, pretty optimistic GDP line in the absence of government actions, because if the US is any guide, I think Japanese GDP should have fallen far more than this, this dotted line. And I say this because the amount of wealth the Japanese lost after the bursting of the bubble is over 3 years worth of Japan's GDP, the national wealth. The amount of wealth the United States lost after the collapse of New York stock market in 1929 is equivalent to 1 year's worth of US GDP. So the balance sheet damage to Japan was 3 times larger than what happened in the United States during the Great Depression. And with 1 year's worth of loss in wealth, US lost 46% of its GDP. So in Japan, 3 times larger than that, GDP should have fallen more than what I penciled in here. But that's too much even for my own blood. So I just drew in this line to see what's the total difference between the actual GDP and this rather optimistic GDP without government action. And if you do the math, it has up to, the difference between the two is over 2,000 trillion. So basically, Japan spent 460 trillion to buy the GDP equivalent to 2,000. I thought that was a pretty good deal. So that's why I thought this is one of the most effective fiscal policy in history. And Japanese companies stopped paying down debt 2005, and Japanese corporate balance sheets are probably now the cleanest in the world. So the original purpose of this fiscal stimulus was achieved. Now, of course, what's left is to fix the government balance sheets. But the point of the Japanese exercise is that no matter how bad the bubble is and the subsequent collapse in asset values, if you put in the fiscal stimulus of the right size from the very beginning and keep it there, it is possible to keep the living standard of the people from falling, allow the private sector to have the income to pay down debt, and then you can actually repair all the private sector balance sheets. And then, of course, after that, the government will have to repair its balance sheets. How much of this is understood among the G20 leaders? Well, I'm happy to tell you that this is understood by G20 leaders, because this is the chart the Prime Minister Aso used during the emergency G20 meeting in Washington, November 2008. And at that time, he said, look, we experienced 87% decline in asset values, but we're still able to keep our GDP from falling. The world hasn't experienced anything like 87% decline yet. If we all put in the fiscal stimulus, we should be able to stabilize the world GDP. That was November 2008, 2 months after Lehman. Everybody agreed. All the countries put in the fiscal stimulus 2009, and as you saw earlier, GDP, industrial production, all of that began recovering. So that was good. This lesson from Japan was utilized in November 2008. Unfortunately, there were 2 parts to the Japanese lesson. That's only the first part. What's the second part? Well, second part is that when you look at this chart, you see 2 bouts of negative growth, 1997, 2001. What happened 1997 and 2001? Well, if you're not in Japan, you would think that, 1997, that's the Asian currency crisis. 2000, wow, that's the bursting of the dot-com bubble. Well, if you're in Japan, you have a different conclusion. 1997, Prime Minister Hashimoto, listening to the IMF, OECD, those people who know nothing about anything, who told Japan that you're wasting all your money on a fiscal stimulus, building bridges to nowhere, roads to nowhere. You have an aging population. Well, why don't you cut your budget deficit? And I was already advising Prime Minister at the time. I said, no, you don't cut now. If you cut, the whole thing will come crashing down. but I'm just a private sector economist, not even Japanese, and all these big shots from around the world and Ministry of Finance all wanted to cut budget deficit. So he did. Raise taxes, cut spending. It was a massive fiscal consolidation effort. And guess what? Economy collapsed first, exactly as I predicted. And this is what happened to the tax receipts and budget deficit. The white bars are the tax receipts. The purple bars are budget deficits. And 1997 is right here. They were supposed to have reduced budget deficit with all that fiscal consolidation, austerity in current term, by 15 trillion yen. And the budget deficit here, as you can see, is a little over 20 trillion. So by raising taxes and cutting spending, they thought they would reduce budget deficit by 15 trillion. Well, guess what? The budget deficit not only failed to decrease, it increased by 16 trillion to 38 trillion yen right here. And because the economy collapsed first, tax receipts fell, budget deficit increased. And same thing again in 2001. Budget deficit, tax receipts fell, budget deficit increased. Now, 2001 was a much smaller, much more moderate attempt by Prime Minister Koizumi trying to limit the issuance of Japanese government bond, JGB, to 30 trillion yen. Now, 30 trillion yen is 6% of Japan's GDP, so it's still a large budget deficit. But the amount of excess savings the private sector was generating was even more than that. And so by trying to limit government borrowing to 30 trillion, government ended up leaving some private sector savings unborrowed, and that then became the deflationary gap of the economy. Japan took 10 years to climb out of this policy mistake. 10 years. As you can see, the budget deficit finally came down to something close to what we had earlier 10 years later. And in the process, this additional deficit that was added to the already big deficit was over 100 trillion yen. So the point is, if you are in this situation where private sector is minimizing debt with zero interest rates, the last thing you want government to do is austerity, cutting budget deficit, because that can destroy the economy, make the situation far worse, both in terms of budget deficit and the GDP. Then you look at individual countries. This is the United States. This is the United States viewed from the data called flow of funds. And I'm sure some of you know how to read this thing, but let me explain how this chart is put together. There's a horizontal line going across at zero. Above zero are the people saving money. Below zero are people borrowing and investing money. There are four lines here: the rest of the world, households, corporate sector, and the government. Four lines are supposed to add up to zero. So what this shows is that on individual years, which sector of the economy was saving money, which sector of the economy was borrowing money. Now, during the bubble days, 2007, 2008, US private sector sorts were borrowing huge sum of money. But where are they now? Both of them above zero. Households here, corporates here. And if you add the two together, especially measure from the lowest point in US private sector savings, this jump in US savings is over 9% of US GDP, a massive increase. And the fact that both of them are above zero means that this is exactly what was happening in Japan earlier. Both the household sector and corporate sector are minimizing debt instead of maximizing profits. And so this is no time to cut budget deficit. If you try to cut budget deficit in this situation, the situation just could get worse and worse and worse, just like in Japan 1997. Now, how much of this is understood in the United States? I'm happy to tell you that a lot of people have read my book, The Holy Grail Macroeconomics. Many hedge funds bought hundreds of copies, distributed to their clients. Even Chairman Bernanke actually read it, and he thanked me for it. Even though in that book, I had some very harsh words for Mr. Bernanke. On all the subsequent meetings I had with him, he never contradicted my argument. And he said, we have the same problem. And as many of you might have noticed, in the last 2.5 years, year and a half, in all occasions, Bernanke came out and said, this is no time to cut budget deficit, because he understands this risk, that if the private sector is deleveraging at zero interest rates, and if the government also tries to delever at the same time, the whole thing can come crashing down, just like what happened in Japan in 1997. So since about February of 2 years ago, Chairman Bernanke has been saying this is no time to cut budget deficit, precisely for this reason, that with both private sector corporates and households above zero, meaning paying down debt or saving money, no matter how much liquidity Federal Reserve inject into the system, the so-called money multiplier is negative at margin. You cannot get the economy going with monetary policy. And therefore, you need fiscal policy, government borrowing and spending money to keep the GDP from collapsing. He fully understands that. A lot of people at the White House fully understands that. And so at least in the United States, at least on the Democratic side, and many of them are actually using this term, balance sheet recession, realizing that U.S. is facing the same danger Japan was facing earlier. Now, unfortunately, that's the extent of understanding in the United States. The Tea Party types, the Republicans, and the general public, I'm afraid, are nowhere near in understanding what's actually happening to them. Individually, everybody's doing the right things, trying to repair their balance sheets, but collectively, they're doing huge harm to the society, to the economy, because this is kind of a fallacy of composition. If everybody's doing, even if everybody's doing the right things, if that right thing happens to be debt repayment, then the macroeconomy suffers unless government comes in to borrow and spend to keep the economy going. Now, this is the UK, exactly the same picture. Private sector lines are both above zero now, and some of them significantly above zero, like the corporate sector. And even though government increased borrowings during the 2009, 2010, now, of course, we have a different government in the UK trying to cut the budget deficit. And I find that very, very dangerous, given that private sector sorts are minimizing debt even with this lowest interest rates in recent memory. And as a result, US, UK in balance sheet recession, interest rates in both countries have come down to very low levels. This chart shows what happened to 10-year government bond yield from 2007 to most recent period. Earlier, when US and UK had a bubble, the interest rate differential between the Japanese 10-year government bond and US-UK 10-year government bond were over 3%. And that was the key reason why Japanese yen was so weak, other currencies were so strong. But now, so you can see the difference between the two is only 0.9%. The level of US and UK interest rates are where Japanese rates were 1997. And with this very narrow interest rate differential, a lot of money that used to flow out of Japan actually came in, and that's one of the reasons why Japanese yen is so strong. And even though there are a lot of people out there who are saying these very low bond yields in the US and UK are nothing but a bubble, I beg to differ, because this is the norm in a balance sheet recession. Bond yields come down to these ridiculously low levels. This is the norm. And the reason is very simple. If you're a fund manager and if you cannot invest, if you cannot take too much foreign exchange risk, and if you want some principal protection, some guarantee on principal, meaning that you cannot put all your money in equities, you have to put some money in bonds. If you're under those constraints, which many investors are actually, and if the private sector is not borrowing money, as you saw earlier, the only thing you can buy at the end of the day, government bonds. And so during a balance sheet recession, funds, these saved funds in the private sector have no other place to go except the government bonds. And that's why bond yields come down to these ridiculously low levels. When Japanese bond yields start falling to less than 2, and everybody thought this is a bubble, it's crazy, and all these hedge funds who didn't understand this tried to short the Japanese JGB market, trying to make tons of money. All of them failed, because this is not a bubble. this is the norm in a balance sheet recession. And this is what happened during the Great Depression as well. Bond yields come down to these ridiculously low levels. And this is the market's way of telling the government and the public that this is no time to cut budget deficit. Because the market is willing to give government money at these very low rates so the government can use it, keep the money supply from shrinking, keep the economy from shrinking. Then the question, if this is the case, why is it not happening in the Eurozone? The bond yields should come down in the Eurozone as well. And if you look at the flow of funds for Eurozone, this is the Eurozone as a whole, Eurozone is definitely in a balance sheet recession with both private sector lines above zero. And this is with the lowest interest rates in Eurozone's history. With corporate line above zero, households line above zero. The entire Euro, with the lowest interest rates in the Eurozone's history, this means the zone is very much in a balance sheet recession. So bond yields should be coming down in the Eurozone. And if you look at but of course that is not what's happening, except for Germany and possibly France, where rates have come down. All the other countries are seeing rates at sometimes ridiculously high levels. And because these rates are high, and Greek bond yields 35% or so, a lot of European governments are saying, in order to avoid the Greek scenario, we all have to cut budget deficit. And as a result, the entire Eurozone is in this austerity mode. But if individual countries are in balance sheet recession, this is the case of Spain. During the balance sheet, during the bubble days, households and companies were borrowing huge sum of money. Now, both of them are above zero. So Spanish bond yields should come down at least to the UK levels, given what's happening to private sector savings. Same thing in Ireland, lies hugely into the positive range for both corporate sector and household sector. Even in Portugal. In Portugal, the corporate line is still below zero, but the household line is way into the positive range compared to where they were just 3-4 years ago. The bond yield should be coming down. Why are they not coming down in the Eurozone? That's the key issue in my view. All the other countries, meaning US and UK, follow the Japanese path, and the bond yields are coming increasingly looking like the Japanese bond yields. And same kind of balance sheet recession mechanism are in place. But in the Eurozone, even though they have the same structural savings, meaning the private sector sort of minimizing debt at near zero interest rates, bond yields are not coming down. Why? Well, the answer to that is actually quite simple as well. As I said earlier, if you're UK or Japanese or US fund managers, and if you face this constraint that you cannot take too much foreign exchange risk, you have to have some principal guarantee, and the private sector not borrowing money, the only thing you can buy are your own government bonds. So if you're a Japanese fund manager, you buy JGBs. If you're a US fund manager, you buy US Treasuries. If you're a British fund manager, you buy gilts. How about in the Eurozone? If you're a Spanish fund manager, do you have to buy Spanish government bonds? And the answer is no. You can buy German government bond, you can buy Dutch government bond, you can buy Finnish government bond, and still meet all these constraints. Because you're not taking additional foreign exchange risk, because these are all same currencies. And they still offer principal guarantee because these are all bonds, and especially government bonds. I was in Spain not too long ago, middle of November, and Nomura, of course, gathered all these key fund managers for a seminar. And I thought it would be a great opportunity for me to ask how many of them are actually moving funds away from Spain. So I asked them, okay, how many of you have moved funds to Germany? And the answer, everybody. Everybody was raising hands. And that's the problem. In the Eurozone, you don't have to buy your own government bonds. You can buy someone else's. And when everybody does it all at the same time, even though in Spain, for example, in Spain, there's huge amount of private sector savings generated inside Spain. This is not staying in Spain. It's going out to Germany. And because it's going out, Spanish bond yields goes up. And when the Spanish government looks at the bond yields going up, says, oh my gosh, we have funding problems. We have to cut our budget deficit. And all these other guys have nothing better to do. The OECD, the IMF, and other types are all telling the Spanish government to cut. So Spanish government tries to cut budget deficit while private sector is deleveraging. That's exactly what happened in 1997 in Japan. Economy weakens further. And when the economy weakens further, people become even more pessimistic about Spain, move funds away from Spain even more, and the situation just gets worse and worse and worse. As a result, Spanish unemployment over 20%. And the youth unemployment rate, people under 25, 46%. And the same thing is happening in other parts of Europe as well. So, and this flow of funds away from Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, those countries that are generating savings to Germany, if those savings enter in Germany, were borrowed and spent by the Germans, then Eurozone as a whole will be still okay. The German economy will be that much more stronger. Germans take longer vacations in Portugal and Spain, and the Eurozone as a whole will be still having GDP going forward. But what are the Germans doing? All this money is flowing to Germany. Short-term German government bonds now offering negative yield. 10-year government bonds offering less than 2% yield. And the Germans are still saying, we're going to cut our budget deficit. So all that money that's entering Germany gets stuck in Germany. It doesn't come out. And so looking at the Eurozone as a whole, it will be shrinking. And it will be continue to shrink until something is done to these problems. Now, this flow, this flight of funds from peripheral to so-called center is actually nothing new. This is just the opposite of what was happening 5-7 years ago. 5-7 years ago, all these bankers in France and Germany, bored to death with these very low interest rates, found that you can have actually higher yields in Greece, Spain, and Portugal, because these economies all had the bubble and were yielding handsome returns. And by investing in Spain, investing in Greece, investing in Portugal, you don't incur additional currency risk. They are all government bonds, so you get the principal guarantee, and you get a higher yield. So all these people thought, why not? So the money was flowing into Spain, Portugal, these economies from Germany, France, Holland. And when you put yourself in the position of a Spanish government official, and you notice that you have a bubble in your hands, housing bubble expanding, there's nothing you can do about it to stop it, because there's no capital controls to keep the German money from coming in. And so the bubble gets worse and worse and worse as more and more money comes in. Once the bubble bursts, and you are in balance sheet recession, and by the way, balance sheet recession happens only after bursting of a bubble. So once you're in a balance sheet recession, you need the government to run larger budget deficit to keep the GDP from collapsing. All the savings actually generated in those economies are going somewhere else, back to Germany or to Holland or Finland or wherever. So this is an extremely destabilizing capital flows, pro-cyclical, destabilizing. During the bubble, it just makes the bubble burst. During the balance sheet recession, it makes the balance sheet recession worse. And so something has to be done to this capital flow that happens only in the Eurozone. It cannot happen anywhere else. If you're a British fund manager, you have to buy gilts. If you're a Japanese fund manager, you have to buy JGBs, but not in the Eurozone. And so when people say, wow, these horrible things have happened to European countries. So Japan, we have to cut our budget deficit. Mr. Osborne in Tokyo yesterday saying we have to cut our budget deficit. They're making a completely wrong arguments in my view. Because that kind of capital flows happens only in the Eurozone. UK is not in the Eurozone. Japan is not in the Eurozone. US is not in the Eurozone. So that comparison, I think, is a huge mistake. Well, what can we do with this Eurozone capital flows, of capital flight? Well, I proposed a rule which is discussed in small circles at the moment, and that is that perhaps one rule was missing all along when they put this artificial currency zone called Euro was put together. And that one missing part was that they should have imposed a rule saying Eurozone governments can issue government bonds only to its own citizens. That only Germans can buy German government bonds, the Spanish can buy Spanish government bonds, and only Portuguese can buy Portuguese government bonds. If that rule were in place 10 years ago, none of the problem we are saying today would have happened. Right? Because the Spanish savings cannot go to Germany and German funds cannot go into Spanish government bonds. And so individual countries will operate like the UK, like the US, like Japan, as far as government bond market is concerned. And if you can only sell government bonds to your own people, and if your own people says the budget deficit is too large, then you just cannot run larger budget deficit. So there's a discipline and a flexibility. Flexibility in the sense that if you allow, if you're in balance sheet recession, and someone explained to the public that, look, you have these problems, private sector is minimizing debt. If the government doesn't run the budget, a larger budget deficit, the whole thing will come crashing down. And if the public agrees with it, these countries should be able to run larger budget deficit. And I've been arguing for a long time. Those of you who read my first book, Balance Sheet Recession 2005 from John Wiley, would know that I've been arguing that Maastricht Treaty is a horribly defective treaty because it has zero provision for balance sheet recession. Today, in Spain, for example, if you add those two private sector lines together, that's 6% of Spanish GDP, these two lines. If you add the two together, it's 6% of Spanish GDP. Maastricht allow government to run only budget deficit 3% of GDP. If the private sector is generating savings 6% of GDP, and the government is only allowed to run budget deficit 3% of GDP, what happens to the remaining 3%? That will become a deflationary gap of the economy right away. GDP will shrink by 3% right there. But there's zero provision in the Maastricht Treaty what to do when you're in that situation. And that's understandable because in 1998, only Japan was experiencing balance sheet recession, and only Japanese understood this concept. It was not in newspapers, it was in academic journals. When Maastricht Treaty was put together in 1998. But now, they are all in this together, but the treaty doesn't make any provision for a situation like this, where private sector under near zero interest rates, saving money like crazy. What do you do when you're in that situation? And so I think Maastricht Treaty should be made more flexible to account for a situation like this. And the way to do it, in my view, is to impose this rule that instead of the 3% limit on budget deficit, they should allow individual countries to sell government bonds only to its own people. So you have both the discipline and the flexibility. If the people agrees that, okay, under the circumstances like this, the government has to run 6% budget deficit, then they should be allowed to do it. And if something goes wrong, only Spanish people will be hurt. No one else is hurt because only Spanish people hold Spanish government bond. And this way, ECB, this European Central Bank, won't have to worry about the individual countries' budget deficit. You know, in the last 2 years, almost every week, ECB is carrying this fire extinguisher from one country to another, trying to fix their fiscal problems. But if only their own citizens hold government bond of that country, then those are internalized to the countries. It's not a Eurozone problem anymore. And ECB can concentrate on running monetary policy instead of running around with a fire extinguisher. So I think that was the missing rule from the very beginning. Of course, we cannot introduce that rule tomorrow because 70% of Greek bonds are now held by foreigners. They're worthless, but still held by foreigners. So what do you do? Well, I think we have to, this 10-year period without that rule resulted in all sorts of imbalances within the Eurozone. And it may take another 5 or 10 years to undo the imbalances. But by having this rule at the end of the day, that's as an end game, that, okay, at end of 5 or 10 years, we will have this rule that individual countries in the Eurozone can only sell government bonds to its own people, then I think it's much easier to put together some sort of a bridge financing between now and that 5 or 10 years. And I think it would be much more comforting for the investors to realize that, okay, at the end of 5 years, at the end of 10 years, Eurozone will become a fully viable currency zone, that none of these problems that we are facing today would happen again. Now, whenever I make this proposal to Eurozone people, the immediate reaction I get is that, no, this is against the whole spirit of single market, that you'll be destroying these efficiency gains, productivity gains of having a single market. But my counter argument to that is that, look, the productivity gain, efficiency gains really accrue only to the private sector. And I'm saying, I'm not proposing any limit on private sector capital flows, that Germans should still be able to buy corporate bonds in Spain, and Spanish investors should be still able to buy German stocks or equities. But for government to be able to run budget deficit, government to be able to tap this larger market, we see no efficiency gains from Greek governments or other governments that run larger deficit during the good old days. And so by just limiting the government side, I think we gain so much more in terms of stability, limiting these crazy capital flows inside the Eurozone, and we still maintain all the efficiency gains for the private sector, which actually matters. So I hope people in Eurozone will think about this proposal little more carefully, because at the end of the day, this may be the only thing that can save the Eurozone, given where it is going. Now, Eurozone has one more problem. Whenever there's a balance sheet recession, I'm afraid there's always a financial crisis to go with it. And we had it in Japan, the US had that problem as well. And Eurozone is, of course, having that problem as well. But I just don't get the sense that agencies within the Eurozone are up to the task, in a sense that I mentioned to you about the so-called pretend and extend, that the American government is now telling the banks, pretend that everything is okay and then please extend the loan. That's the kind of measures you need when you are faced with what I call systemic banking crisis. Systemic banking crisis means all banks have the same problem at the same time. Now, ordinary banking crisis, one or two banks having problems, but the rest are okay. In that situation, you can do a lot of things. For example, you can force them to write off problem loans quickly, force them to raise capital quickly, and more disciplinary actions. But when all banks have the same problem at the same time, which is the case in Eurozone today, what happened to Japan when commercial real estate prices fell 87%, what's happening in the US at the moment, when all banks have the same problem at the same time, bank regulators must think very, very differently, sometimes completely differently. You cannot force banks to write off problems too quickly, because if you do that, and if all the banks trying to dump their assets on the market, but when all banks have the same problem at the same time, there will be no buyers. Asset prices collapse even further, and the situation just gets worse and worse and worse. And I learned this the hard way. I was a syndicated loan desk officer at the New York Fed when the Latin American debt crisis happened in 1982. And those of you who are old enough to remember what a mess that one was, when all countries south of Texas-Mexican border went bankrupt, all the way to the southern tip of Chile. And American banks, against the best advice from the New York Fed, lent massively to that part of the world. August 1982, all except one US money center bank were bankrupt. It was that bad, thousands of others with it. And Paul Volcker immediately realized that this is a systemic banking crisis, not ordinary banking crisis, and gave us all sorts of directives. Some of them I thought was positively illegal, trying to keep this whole system from collapsing. And some of the things we had to do telling banks to stay lending, continue lending to Mexico, knowing fully well that Mexico is bankrupt, just to keep this semblance of order until banks themselves have enough capital to write off problem loans. The whole process took about 12 years, from 1982 all the way to early part of 1990s. But if it handled correctly, these things can be handled. And the Latin American debt crisis, the worst banking crisis in post-war history, at least up to that point, did not cost US taxpayers even $1 because it was handled so beautifully. And in Japan, because I had that experience, because I was in the middle of that whole process, 1982 at the New York Fed, I brought that experience to the Japanese, and Japanese also follow that rule. So even though Japan got bashed by a lot of journalists who had nothing better to do, who argued that Japan is too slow in writing off problem loans, those guys don't know what they're talking about. I mean, when asset prices are down 87% nationwide, you don't go very quickly. You go very slowly. And Paul Volcker, of course, was also backing the Japanese as well. He wrote a paper published in the Japanese journal Toyo Keizai, where he said, don't listen to these American cowboys who don't know what they're talking about. You have a systemic banking crisis. You have to go slowly. Japanese government should establish a speed limit on how fast the bankers are allowed to write off problem loans. Speed limit. That's how you handle systemic banking crisis. And Europe has a systemic banking crisis. All banks have the same problem at the same time. And what is EBA doing, European Banking Authority? EBA is telling the bankers, you have to raise capital to 9% within 6 months to the June of this year. When all banks have the same problem at the same time, who would provide that 9% capital to these banks? Well, maybe Chinese will contribute a little bit, maybe Japanese a little bit, but that's about it. American banks are having a lot of problems themselves. When the problem is this large and the distrust between European banks this serious, they should go as slow as possible. And the government should be backing all the banks as quickly as possible. And even though there is a little talk of a capital injection, they're saying, well, if the private sector failed by June of this year, government might think about putting in some capital. Well, that's the wrong order. They should do the capital injection as the first resort and get all the banks more or less in halfway decent shape, stabilize the situation, and then you should start thinking about how much the private sector can then take over the burden. Not the other way around, because under the current situation, European banks are having extreme difficulty raising capital, and as you probably know, Japanese financial institutions are flooded with requests from European banks, either to buy their shares or take over their business and so forth, because Europeans themselves cannot find people in Europe to fund new capital issuance. And so these are the areas that needs to be addressed. I hope EBA, instead of insisting on this 9% capital requirement, will drop it to 7, which is the Basel III, which is to be met by, what, 2019? That's the Basel III. And I think EBA should bring the limit to this requirement to the Basel III instead of adding 2% on top of it and insisting that banks come up with this capital within the next 6 months. I think it's just pure madness. And the fact that EBA came up with this 9% rule means European banks cannot increase their assets. They might have to shrink it to meet the 9% rule. That very fact completely destroys the effectiveness of ECB, European Central Bank, monetary policy. Because how does monetary policy work? Monetary policy is designed to increase money available to the private sector. But who makes the money available to the private sector? The banks. So if the banks cannot increase their lending because of this 9% rule limit from the EBA, no matter how much liquidity ECB injects into the system, it cannot circulate because the bankers cannot increase their assets. And so they're completely working cross purposes. This is not a time for EBA to be insisting on 9% rule. Even 7%, I would argue, is probably very tough for European banks. But that 7% is to be reached 2019. And so by scuttling the EBA limit and bringing to, returning to the Basel III should give a lot of leeway for European banks and for ECB as well. But until those issues are addressed, I'm afraid European situation will continue to remain very serious because ECB, even adding all this liquidity, still cannot get banks to increase their asset base because they cannot increase the asset base because of the EBA's rule. Those are the challenges I see in Europe today. And I hope they learn more from what happened to us in Japan. In Japan, we tried to do a lot of these mistakes too, trying to increase capital base and force banks to write off problem loans too quickly, causing even more problems at that time. And so, viewed from the Japanese experience, I don't get the sense that the world is moving in the right direction, especially in Europe. For the US, well, at least some people are aware of it. Financial types are aware of it. Some policymakers are aware of it, but that's not true with the average public. Well, how about Japan? Well, when LDP was running the show, most LDP politicians understood this balance sheet recession risk and were very careful with raising taxes and cutting spending. But with DPJ in place, they have very little understanding of any of what I just said here. And they're talking about raising taxes and cutting spending, as you know. But if you look at the Japanese flow of funds, this is the Japanese flow of funds. After the bursting of the bubble, the corporate lines start coming down as corporate balance sheets were repaired. And I was hoping that this line will go negative, which means the Japanese economy is back to the normal world. But just as it was coming down to the negative range, Lehman shock hit, and the Japanese companies start moving on self-defense mode again, as you can see, this part. And a recent tsunami and all that brought this down a little bit, but both corporate line and households line are above zero today. So I'm afraid Japan is back into this balance sheet defense mode. And I much rather see government spending more efforts trying to make these companies to borrow money again first before thinking of raising taxes and cutting spending. Because if government tries to cut spending or raise taxes when private sector is deleveraging or paying down debt, we may fall into another double dip kind of situation, just like what happened to us in 1997. And so a lot of things were learned, but a lot of things still remain to be learned, unfortunately, from the Japanese experience, the previous experience. Thank you very much.